Today we have the Nikon Z8 and the Canon R5 MKII. We got a lot of questions on the channel asking a comparison of these two cameras for wildlife photography, how they stack up with the new autofocus, the Canon R5 MKII, and the new stack sensor versus Nikon Z8 and the Z9, same camera. Basically, we'll talk about that later, but how do they stack up? So let's talk about it. Well, I wanted to do this video outside, but I wasn't able to because this is what outside looked like today here in Alaska. Cold, wet, rainy, windy. It's blowing like 30 to 40 in gusts out there. It's pretty nasty. So I couldn't really do the video outside, even though I really want to. I really don't like doing them in the studio, but that's where we're at today. We're going to do this in the studio. Well, let's talk about these two cameras to start with. The Nikon Z8 is about a year old, and the Canon R5 MKII is just under 3 months. I've had it since day one of release on this camera, and I really like it. I've been using it quite a bit. But I also love my Z8 and the Z9. Let's talk about these two cameras real quick. They are the exact same camera, minus GPS this doesn't have, and minus the battery grip and the integrated battery grip from the Z9. They are identical cameras. So in reality, for the Z8, I've had over 2 years to work with the Z8 because I've had the Z9 for that long. So I have a lot of time on this camera, the sensor, and how it works, because autofocus, everything works exactly the same with these two cameras. So I have a lot of time in this camera, a lot less time on this camera, but enough time to understand what it does and how it shoots. Well, let's get into the most obvious thing that we talk about in all camera reviews, and of course that always starts off with ergonomics, how the cameras feel in the hand. Be honest with you, all cameras anymore feel really good in the hand, and Nikon and Canon and these two cameras did an exceptionally well job of that again. Like I said, plenty of room for your hand. Even without the grip, you almost have enough room for your pinky. Plenty of room between your grip and the lens when you have them attached. Same on the Canon, not a problem. Both grips, I have the grip for both cameras. I only have it on the R5 MKII here for visual reference right now. Both grips feel extremely good and work really well. And that's what I always prefer, is to have a grip on the camera. They just feel a lot better when you're moving around and carrying around the field, especially with these larger lenses that we use every day. Next thing about ergonomics for me is button layout of these two cameras. They are different in the layout. Now, I like the button layout on both cameras, but the one thing that I like better on the Nikon is where the video switch is. I like that they both have a dedicated video and still switch. The Canon is on the left side here, on this left side. The Nikon is actually over here on the right side. Why do I like that better? Well, if I've got this up, I got a lens on. If I need to switch from stills to video with the switch, that is, I've got to take my hand off the lens on the Canon to hit the switch. With Nikon, I can just flip it right here with my left hand, not a problem. My right hand, excuse me, can't tell from my right from my left. But I can switch it with the right hand, not an issue whatsoever. The other difference on these two cameras is the Canon has 3 dials, the Nikon has 2 dials for assigning ISO, aperture, shutter that we like to do for most photographers and wildlife photography. And the Canon, like I said, has 3, has the dial here, dial here, dial here. Nikon only has 2, has the front dial and the back dial, no other dials. And the other drawback for me as a Canon shooter moving to Nikon, moved into it 2 years ago, was that ISO switch. To change the ISO on a Nikon camera, you actually have to put an ISO button and then roll a dial. At first, that was really off-putting to me, but after using it for a couple months, I got really used to it. And be honest with you, when I pick up my Canon, sometimes I'm reaching for that button and I hit the video start, and sometimes start video accidentally. But I got where I really like that, so it's really not that big a deal for me anymore. But if you're jumping from Canon to Nikon, know that you don't have 3 dials. You would have to hit a button to do the ISO. Now, the next thing us wildlife photographers like to do is dual button focus, or dual button focus. With the Canon, this is very easy. You have plenty of buttons on the back of here to assign things to. On the Nikon, you can get dual back button, but it kind of takes away from other functions on the camera. So the thing that I've always done is I've assigned my eye focus to AF on, and my front button on the front is my single point. So on the Canon, I just move my thumb back and forth between the two for eye autofocus and single point. On the Nikon, I'm always going back, front, which is fine. I've gotten used to both of them, so I know when I pick the camera up what I've got. Now, the only thing is sometimes with the R5 Mark II, I'm reaching for that button every once in a while, but once I feel it's not there, my brain triggers and says, oh, there's not a button there, you're on the Canon, not the Nikon. So it's just, it's all muscle memory with your fingers, your hands, where your buttons and your dials are. For memory card slots, they both have a Type B and an SD card slot. No difference there whatsoever. They both have a kind of a friction lock on the battery door, which is really nice. Neither of them have a lock like the Z9 does. Makes it really nice to get in and out of those card door slots. I like both of them that way. Now that leads us to the buffer on these two cameras. This is where they really, really differ. And also with their frame rates. We'll talk about frame rates in a minute. We'll talk about buffer here first. The Canon R5 Mark II will get about 3 seconds around there at 30 frames a second before it hit the buffer and stop. And then it'll pick back up a little bit after it offloads those to the card. You get about 5 seconds or more at 20 frames a second, and then it'll hit stop is what you're going to get, about 5 seconds. With the Z8 and the Z9 at 20 frames a second, it's pretty much unlimited. You just hit it, and it's just going to keep going and keep going and keep going. It's not going to stop. Now, it may be from 20 frames a second, just drop down a little bit to about 17, 16 frames a second, but it's going to continually just keep shooting the whole time. You're not going to run out of that buffer on this camera, which is really, really crazy and really cool. As far as those frame rates these two cameras will shoot, the Nikon Z8 will only shoot up to 20 frames per second in RAW. It will do up to 120 frames a second in JPEG, but I don't shoot JPEG because I want to shoot in RAW so I can have more editing ability. But it only go up to 20 frames a second. Only. That's still really fast, so don't think only is slow. But the Mark II, the Canon R5 Mark II, will shoot up to 30 frames per second in RAW, which is really nice. Do we need 30 frames? 20's, to me, acceptable and works great, but having that little extra is really nice with the Canon R5 Mark II. The next thing that they handle differently is how they do pre-capture, or in Canon they call it pre-continuous shooting, pre-capture on the Z8. And that is frames captured before you hit the shutter button. When you put them in those modes, they operate completely different. The Nikon Z8, it does not shoot in RAW in that pre-capture, it shoots in JPEG. So again, for pre-capture, this camera's out. It's out the window. I don't use it. Now, if there's a certain instance, I may flop it in JPEG, play with it, but usually if I need to do pre-capture, I'm not going to use this camera. The Canon got it right, kind of like the Sony A9 III. It's in RAW, which makes it really nice for a full-frame camera. Yes, there are Micro Four Thirds and stuff that will do this, but we're talking about these full-frame cameras and these two cameras only. This one will capture in RAW, and it'll get 15 frames before you hit the button. Really, really cool. This one will go up to 120 frames before you hit the button. But again, it's in JPEG, so we're not going to use it. We're going to use this one for pre-capture. So that's one of the things to determine if you're thinking about the two cameras is that part of it in RAW. And I keep thinking that Nikon is going to get this into RAW through a firmware, but they have yet to do it, or maybe even give us 30 frames a second. They haven't. So after 2 years that one, I don't think we're going to see it on these models, these two cameras. Maybe, but I doubt it. But for pre-capture, if you're considering it, this is the camera you're going to go with if that's what are your considerations for it. Let's get into autofocus of these two cameras and how they work. So I think that's what a lot of you guys really want to know is how does the bird autofocus on the Z8 and the Z9 stack up to the R5 Mark II? And I'll tell you what, they're neck and neck. They're almost identical. I've ran these tests on birds. I've like I said, I've shot these two cameras forever. I've shot this for a few months, and really mainly on birds with this guy up in the Arctic and here around the Anchorage Bowl and along the Kenai Peninsula and all that, shooting these two, and they're both fantastic. Birds in flight, they both just snap them and lock them up instantly. They hang on to them really well, close up and really far away. They have no problem shooting birds. They're really good about getting birds even around the grasses. And if you do have issues with too much grass in front, you single point, get past it, and then the autofocus usually locks right up on them. I don't have it too often, either one of these two cameras, like I showed you with the R5 when I did the comparison of the R5 Mark II and the R5, where the R5 would sometimes lock up another subject besides the bird. There are times that both of them will get confused with something besides the bird, but it's very, very seldom, and they both act a lot alike. Where do I see the differences in the two? Well, two things. One is when you have a lot of birds in the scene, you have a lot of ducks. The R5 Mark II will sometimes not always lock up the most obvious bird. It may lock up one a little bit farther than the scene than the one you wanted, or a little more left or right. It seems like whichever bird it finds first, it will grab and hold on to. The Z8 usually tends to lock onto one that's a little bit closer to you and more obvious in the frame, bigger in the frame. It seems to jump to the obvious bird to me. The Canon sometimes wants to jump to a different bird. It's kind of interesting sometimes. So how do I overcome that with the Canon? If I've got that situation going on, I put it in single point with subject detect, and then I can kind of single out my bird, and it works a lot better that way. Second thing that's different in the two is how they work in low light or dark colored birds amongst foliage and things like that. So I've noticed is when it gets really dark, it's really hard to shoot anyway. You're pushing some nasty ISOs. The bird's back in the dark. The Nikon will lock up the bird a lot better. And I had one situation with these two cameras that was really interesting the other day where I had a Stellar J, and it was on the ground around some brush and kind of under the base of a evergreen tree. And I had the Canon out first. And a Stellar J's head is black with a little bit of blue, then it goes into blue to the body if you've ever seen one. And this camera was having a hard time locking the bird's head in the eye. It would lock a limb or hit stuff around it, not the head as much. Every once in a while, if I single point, got it closer, got it on it, it kind of grabbed it. Once it got a little bit of reflection on that eye, a little more contrast. What was interesting, when I grabbed the Z8 real quick and pulled it up to the same bird, same place, it hit it every time. It locked that head up almost every time. It is really telling. So things that are darker in dark shadows and really dark birds' heads, the Z8 and the Z9, because they're the same autofocus, lock that bird up a lot better. So that's the only difference in the autofocus in these two that I've noticed really well. And I can put them both in auto area AF. That's what I'm talking about, where it looks at the whole screen and locking the bird up. I'm not doing any special small boxes with this one or this one. I'm not doing any pass-off methods of this. I'm just leaving them auto area AF, the whole thing, and hitting the eye autofocus, and they're jumping to the bird, which is just incredible, which I like. So really, the autofocus on these two is a wash, unless you shoot really dark birds or really in shadows, and this one does a little bit better. And that's for birds. Animals, different matter altogether. The Z8 does really well with animals for most time. A lot of animals are big, but when I have Dall sheep way up on the hill or things like that, or I've got something a little farther out, the R5 Mark II does a lot better on animals. It seems to lock it up than the Z8 does. Now, they both still lock them up extremely well. I'm extremely happy with it, but when you've got some odd animals like a Dall sheep or a bighorn sheep, I guess, for you guys more south of me, up on a hill, the Z8, Z9 sometimes doesn't really see it, doesn't know what it is. The R5 Mark II jumps right to it when it's small in the frame. Also, animals that are way away from you, the R5 Mark II works a little better than the Z8. Now, as far as birds, like we talked earlier, it doesn't matter, they're a wash. But for animals, the R5 Mark II is just a touch better with that regards there. Another thing to do differently too is how you set the menus up for switching from birds to animals. With the R5 Mark II, you don't have to set anything. Set it to animal, you're good for birds and animals, works great. For the Z8, you have to switch from bird to animal if you're going to shoot birds, and you have to make that switch to get the best out of the camera. Through testing, shooting just animals with birds, it's not as accurate, but switching to bird and hitting the birds is much more accurate. It works much better if you're in bird for shooting birds. Also with auto, don't leave it in auto because it does not hit the birds as well as it does in bird. Same thing for animals. If I'm shooting foxes, I'm in bird, it will hit the fox, but it won't always grab the eye. It'll grab the ear, the butt, things also, or the whole body is more than it would if I switched it to animals. So with the Z8, you have to make sure you're in the right mode. So you're going to set a button up there in the eyepiece to say jump from these two modes when you're shooting animals to birds in the field. Canon, you don't have to do that, which is really nice. And the hit rate on these two cameras, that's what we'll talk about next, is both really good. So autofocus locking through the viewfinder, you look at it, is all fine and dandy. But when you go back and look at the images on the laptop or your computer, you can see how well did that autofocus and the motors work getting to that animal. And with the Z8 and Z9, that's the one thing I was really, really happy with, is how good the hit rate was on this thing. Was fantastic. Very, very few pictures that were out of focus. When this thing was telling me it's in focus, I'm hitting the shutter, pretty much was dead on with the hit rate. The R5 Mark II, the exact same thing. Sensors on these two cameras, I should have talked about that earlier, but we're going to get to it now at least. The sensor readout speed on the R5 Mark II is 6.6 milliseconds. The Z8, 4 milliseconds, both extremely, extremely fast, which means on both cameras, rolling shutter is minimal. Yes, the Z8 is going to be a little bit better in rolling shutter, but at that fast, both cameras, it's really not an issue where you're shooting anything. We're shooting in wildlife photography, hummingbirds, fast action. They're both going to freeze that action and not have any weird bowing, or when you're whip panning with trees, you're not going to see any bowing really in those trees. You may see a touch, but not enough really to matter in most situations. And the image quality in these two cameras is incredible on this sensor. From the shadows to the highlights is extremely good. The range of colors in both cameras really good. One thing I wanted to know are the colors really different on these two cameras? And to be honest with you, they're extremely, extremely close in the color rendition they both produce. And one of the tests I did on this was taking the same lens on both cameras. I went down to the Seward Sea Life Center to photograph some birds and stuff that I knew I could sit there, it would sit long enough to me. And one of the things I did was I took the same lens, like I said, the 500 f4 between the two. And we'll look at a couple images here. And we can look at the colors on the beaks and on the head of this king eider here real quick. And what you'll notice is these colors are fairly close to each other. Really not that much difference. The one on the left is the Z9. The one on the right is the Canon R5 Mark II. And one thing I do notice on the two cameras is how they rendition in the warm colors and in the magentas with the R5 Mark II. The R5 Mark II did a much better job of getting those magentas under control. I don't have to shift for as much for it with the R5 Mark II as I did with the R5. But I will say the two differences in the two cameras is, pleasingly for me, because this is more aesthetic for all of you, because people have different shooting needs, different types of animals and birds. But for me, the Z8 gives a little bit better in those highlights and those warm areas. And what I noticed, I really liked that color, that rim light, that warm color, that edge color is better on the Z8 is when I shot a fox. The very first pictures I took with the Z9 when I had it out was of a fox right at sunset. And when that light hit across her, I just really liked the way that looked on the edge of her fur where that warm light was hitting it. Something I hadn't seen in the R5 and with the R5 Mark II since shooting it than I did with the Z8. I just like the warm. So if you look back in this image, to me, these browns up in here and this kind of where it gets a little more orange off the yellow is more pleasing to me too. But you can also see the magenta shifts in this one are a lot hotter than they are on the Nikon in the two cameras, looking at the images. So it's really, really interesting there. Let's see if we can find one more image to look at here. Let's look at these two real quick. So the right one's the Z9, the left one is the R5 Mark II. And again, the same thing. I noticed a little more magenta reds over here, a little more orangish over here. Again, it's very, very small. We can look back here in the back of the head and I'm kind of seeing the same thing. They're both incredibly well. If I held these two up without telling you which camera it was, you wouldn't be able to pick between the two which one it was. It's more of an aesthetic thing when you go to edit. And what I've noticed with these two cameras is I have less editing I do with the Nikon Z8 versus the R5 Mark II. Very, very small, but it's a little bit. But for image quality, I prefer the Z8, but the R5 Mark II is nothing to sneeze at. They're both incredible. That's what I can say there. Let's look at a couple more of some ducks that I have here. And we'll look at those colors again to show you. Now, those images I showed you with these two just then, we're using the exact same lens, using the EF 500 f4 by Canon, because I can put it on both cameras to see that. With native lenses, what I noticed was not much of a difference really. As far as that color rendition, I was seeing kind of the same thing. So let's look at these two images here. And there is one thing I've noticed that's really interesting. Let's look at this duck here real quick. So let's look at his feet real quick. And if I had to tell you to pick these two, which one was which as far as colors and image quality, I don't think you could pick them. And what's interesting is the left one's the Z9, the right one's the R5 Mark II. Both these cameras have the exact same settings on them. I'm using the 2-800 on the R5. I'm using the 18600 on the Z8. They're both set at f8, 1600th second at 1600 ISO. Exactly the same. And what's interesting, if you look at the two images, the Canon looks darker to me in the image versus the Nikon. Exact same duck, taking exact same light, no difference. If I look at these two birds, you'll see them. You'll see it just looks a little bit darker in the two. Focus points may be a touch off, but as far as the colors go, there's really not that much difference in colors here. Again, I like the rim light a little bit better on the Z8 here on the edge of the leg versus the R5 Mark II, but again, it's very, very small. And as far as the shadows, the sharpness, image quality, the colors, they both look just incredible, just incredible. But again, I do like that edge color a little bit better. And if you look down here in this, I like the colors a little bit better down here in this log and a little bit in the water, but they both look incredible. I would tell you if I put these two up to you and put a series of these images between the two, you probably couldn't pick which one was which of the two cameras as far as goes. So as far as image quality, they both are incredible. But again, at the end of the day, I do prefer the images coming off of the Z8 for my personal aesthetic, because this is really aesthetic taste here when you talk about this. We're getting this level of image quality and the color rendition. That's what it is. A lot of people will talk about sharpness all the time, but they don't talk about color rendition, because that's what will really gets you. Because like this R5 Mark II, you take it versus the R10, which is a lower level camera, you will see a lot more magenta shifts and a lot more green shifts in the image color of that camera versus this one. That's color rendition. So sharpness is always good on all these cameras and all these lenses. It depends on what the color rendition out of the lenses and the camera bodies are. I was really expecting to see more of a color rendition shift once I had native lenses on this versus both shooting the same lens. But that's what we came out to, that the color rendition is really close. But I did notice this R5 Mark II at the same ISO settings, even using the EF500 f4, it's just a little bit darker in the image than the other one. The contrast looked the same to me, but that's kind of where I am with the image quality of these two cameras. Both incredible. Now, high ISO, the two cameras. Both cameras are stacked sensors, which inherently gives you less dynamic range. We talked about this earlier a little bit. And on paper, the Mark II has a little bit better dynamic range than the Z8. How does that really interpret in the real world? Well, both are great and doesn't really impact our daily shooting. You didn't hear a whole lot of griping about the dynamic range of the Z8 and Z9, but for some reason it's the new clickbait on this R5 Mark II. And as I've talked in the previous video, the light ring conversion was not good for the Mark II, or not even for the Z8. And now that the DxO's out for this R5 Mark II, you can see from that last video, it's really, really good. We had 25,000, 51,000 ISO images and they looked fine. And the Z8 and Z9 in low light, I have no issues with. They've looked good since day one shooting this camera in these high ISO situations. I've shot plenty of shots up in that 10,000 plus and had no problem with the images coming out of this camera. And whatever loss we have in dynamic range versus some other cameras is not a big deal, because these cameras are really made for shooting fast action out in the wild. They're not really made to be shooting landscape. I mean, they both do landscape incredibly well and portraiture. But we're talking about wildlife here, and what we really want of these cameras is that fast shutter speed. We want that fast sensor readout speed, so we don't have rolling shutter. That's what we're really worried about. And I'll take a hit in dynamic range for those features of these two cameras. Okay, on to battery life for these two guys. This is where they differ also, and this is the one gripe I had on this camera, this Z8. The one big gripe I had of this camera was the battery life. They took all the features out of the Z9 and stuck it in the Z8 with a small battery, and it sucks it up. It goes through batteries extremely fast. For the R5 Mark II, it seems to me like the battery life is the same as the R5. No big difference there, but the battery life is better on this camera versus the Z8. The R5 Mark II wins out there for battery life for me. You need to be running the grip of this guy and multiple batteries if you're going to be shooting this Z8. Definitely need to. R5 Mark II works pretty good as far as battery life goes. So yeah, you took a hit there, and that's the one reason this camera drives me up the wall sometimes. If I'm running with it just like this, I'll run out of battery way too quick. As far as image stabilization goes, the two cameras, they are both incredible. Great image stabilization. The R5 Mark II on paper wins out at 8.5 stops versus Z8 with the compatible lenses at 6 stops. But using them in the field, as far as imaging stills, when shooting just stills, both great. Don't notice any problems whatsoever. Going to video, I don't have any problems with image stabilization either. But the Z8 still wins out just by a hair, I mean a small amount. Both these cameras, when you go to shoot video and you hit that record button on it, you will see that image go from a little bit shaky to just lock it in steady really, really well. Now you still have to steady your body and things like that, but if you got your body steadied, you will notice that that will steady on that image very, very well in the video image stabilization. But the Z8 still just locks on as a little more steady when you're hand holding video versus the R5 Mark II. Now, the R5 Mark II, to me, out of all the R series cameras, I haven't shot the R1 yet, though, that is. But as of the others, this is right up there with the R3 or better with the image stabilization as far as in video. Just incredible on both these cameras for video in image stabilization and for the stills. The image stabilization is great on both cameras. Now, let's talk about video on these two cameras. This is where it does, again, get close to each other, but also separate and different. The difference in the two cameras is now this guy has C-Log 2, which is really, really good. But the N-Log on this guy, I feel, is just right there with it. So C-Log 2 and N-Log both, to me, grade really well. You can pull a lot of those with your highlights and your shadows and your colors. You can really work on these two guys really well when you're shooting in log. For the non-log, it gets right back to the way the stills are. They're both great. The colors out of both these things look great when you're not using the log settings. Again, I find the colors just look a little bit warmer to me out of the Z8. Again, it's aesthetic to me because it's so small, but with just a little bit of tweaking in post, I get them both back there. It's not like in stills where I have to edit a little bit more on this one. This one, I just got to tweak the colors just a touch differently than I tweak them when I'm tweaking the Z8 as far as color grading at the end on non-log footage, but they're both incredibly well. The autofocus locks on good. Both of them in video is incredible. Again, stabilization a touch better on this guy. Video codecs for the two cameras is a little bit different. Not a whole lot, but just a little bit. The R5 Mark II and the Z8 will both shoot 8K up to 60 frames per second, but the Mark II will do that in 12-bit versus Z8 in 10-bit. Not a big difference, but if you're really into your video, you'll notice a touch of difference there. I don't shoot 8K 60, I always shoot 4K 120, so that's what I don't really care about, and they both shoot 4K 120. Now, the difference is the Z8 will shoot that in crop mode. R5 Mark II, you can't. You have to drop down to 2K 120 to shoot in a crop mode, to shoot a crop sensor format type thing. So the Z8 wins a little bit there for wildlife photography for me. As far as the image quality, again, like I said, I prefer this a little touch better with the Z8, but they're both almost identical as far as that goes. Now, as far as sounds of two cameras when you're in full electronic, now the R5 Mark II has sound, but it only has one sound. The Z8 gives you a choice of 5 sounds. You can actually find the sound you want to use in this camera to make it more aesthetically pleasing to you, and that's kind of why I like the Z8 just a touch better, but it is so nice to have shutter sounds out of this R5 Mark II now. Now let's talk about the LCDs on the back. Well, the Canon, you know, always has the flippy screen that works just like always. Really nice. But for wildlife photography, most of the time, if we're going to shoot low, we just need to be able to look at the back of the camera. We don't need a forward-facing screen. And that's where the Z8 does not have one. It has a kind of interesting, it does not flip out to the side, but it will at least go into downward mode when you're shooting low, or if you need to get into portrait mode, you can get like this into portrait mode, getting low, or you can get into this type of low mode, but you cannot flip it all the way out to the side. So to me, that's not a really big deal as far as the way the LCDs work in these two cameras. So it's kind of a wash again to me. I don't dislike or have anything to say about the LCDs. They both are bright. They both can see everything in them that I need to see when I review images. That's about all I do on the back of it, really. Unless I am going to get low, and then yes, it is nice to get these screens flipped out where I can not have to get all the way on the ground for a quick shot. That's about all I use them for. But the EVFs, that's where they kind of change a little bit. The R5 Mark II has 5.7 million dot half-inch screen, and the Z8 has a 3.7 million dot half-inch LED here. both 120 megahertz on the refresh rate. And right out of the box, the brightness on the R5 Mark II is really good. The clarity is really, really good in the back of this thing. It's something I really loved about this R5 Mark II. And it's interesting, the resolution being less than the refresh, I actually, if I put this at +2 on the brightness, I actually prefer the Z8 viewfinder to the R5 Mark II. And that's really interesting. It just seems like the clarity in what I can see, and it looks a little better. I could bump this up 1 or 2, but I still kind of like the way this one looks a little better. Again, these are into aesthetic things again. Remember that. These are more aesthetic, and as you look at them, you may see it differently. But the EVFs on both cameras are incredible, incredible. I do give the edge, for me personally, to that Z8 because I like the way it kind of is just a little more color clarity in there versus the R5 Mark II, but both are really, really good. Another really cool thing that the Canon R5 Mark II has that the Z8 doesn't have as far as the infographics is you can actually see the focal length of your lens. So normally you can, to see that, you would have to look at the outside of your lens to see what millimeter you're at. But with the R5 Mark II, you can actually see if you're 200, 400, 500, 600, which is really nice when I was trying to compare these two cameras together to get this 2-800 at 600 millimeters versus the 600 millimeters of 180 to 600, is I could actually see that in there as I was zooming out to get there and find that exact 600 millimeters, having to pull the neoprene back to figure out where that was at. So really, really cool feature there. All right, the conclusion. Both cameras are sensational wildlife cameras. Let's just get that out of the way right now. Both feel great in the hand. You can get to everything you need to without leaving the viewfinder and see it all in great quality to set your exposure up correctly. The Z8 has a little better layout for controls with the on-off and the video switch being on the right, and the Mark II has a better layout for dual button focus setups. So you have to decide which of these two is more important to you. And the thing I think most people wanted to know is the autofocus comparisons, and the answer in birds, it's just neck and neck. Both acquire very, very fast and hang on very well. And this is an auto area I'm talking about for both of them, corner to corner, grab the bird. The only times I think the Z8 wins is with multiple birds in the same scene, where the Z8 seems to lock onto the logical bird first. But again, this is an odd situation and easily overcome on the Mark II. But if you shoot more animals over birds, and at distance especially, then the Mark II comes out ahead. But again, nothing you couldn't quickly overcome with the Z8. Another big thing that most of us wanted to compare is how the image looks coming off the camera. And this one is more personal preference for each of us. Both capture amazing images, but the color edition of the Z8 is more for my personal touch and my preference, and for me, it just means a little less editing. But I'm happy with both cameras and the images are being captured. So where do these two cameras separate themselves as far as wildlife photography? Well, there's a couple of areas. And one is in pre-capture, with only the Mark II being suitable as it shoots in RAW and a higher FPS, and also in that frames per second where you can shoot 30 versus 20 on the Z8. But the buffer is far superior on the Z8, which is almost unlimited, while the Mark II stops about 5 seconds at 20 frames per second. So my final advice on these two is which of these things are more important to you? The type of image color rendition, pre-capture in RAW, buffer performance, as all the other things are kind of a wash, really. And the final thing is the lenses that both manufacturers have to offer. Which of these may be more appealing to you? And I'm talking about OEM lenses, not third-party lenses. As far as Pro Series lenses, Nikon is just knocking it out of the park. Lower level lenses, both are doing great here, affordable and great performing. Now the Nikon PF series is another appealing lens series for wildlife shooters. Not really my personal preference, but a lot of folks really like these lenses for their lightweight and image quality. So I hope this breakdown really helps more than confuses, but my biggest takeaway is which lens lineup do you already have or want to invest in, and then weigh out the cameras again. And as always guys, until next time we talk, get outside and go run that shutter.